much and welcome everybody in this webinar about how to build an efficient regulatory strategy to launch medical devices in both the US and the EU. And before getting started, I wanted to tell you a little bit about myself. I started in RAQA in the medical device field almost 15 years ago. And I worked in multinationals as well as in startup companies. And the fact of how to launch a medical device, especially if you're targeting multiple regions, has always been a challenge. So I'm really happy to do this webinar to share some of the insights and the learnings I've had throughout the years, which might help you to do this in a more efficient way. So, yes. What we'll look at is the similarities and the differences between the two regions, and then really delve into how to avoid double work, how to approach launching medical devices in those regions in a more efficient way, and how to make use of certain tools to do so. So in general, over the past few years, the perception on what is, let's say, more difficult, is it more difficult to enter the US market or the EU market, has changed a bit. At least I can tell you from an EU perspective that at the time before the MDR, we looked at the US market to be, let's say, a bit more strict or more difficult to enter. And this has changed since 2017, when the MDR, the medical device regulation, and the IVDR, the in vitro diagnostic regulation, have come into play. That perception kind of shifted, not because US all of a sudden becomes more easy, but at least there is more clarity, or that's the perception at this point. This is also what we see within our customer base. So let's see how to tackle the differences and the similarities. Because let's start with stating maybe a very obvious thing, but the US is one country. They have one language and they have one legislation to cover the medical devices. In the EU is actually an economical and political vehicle for 27 countries with their own national legislations and their own languages and so on. But in the EU, we have two regulations, which are legislations on the EU level, being the medical device regulation and the in vitro diagnostic regulation. So that's already a first difference. We have one legislation versus two. And on top of that, you can have national requirements that are embedded in the national laws that come on top of the EU requirements. So there is already one difference between the two regions. However, both regions, all legislators have one common objective, and that's to bring safe and performant devices to the market. They want to ensure that there is a framework to that actually gives requirements regarding safety, regarding efficacy, regarding quality of the products that are allowed to enter the market. So even though the exact requirements might be different, the general goals are the same. There is no difference. All legislators want to ensure that the patients and the users of those devices are protected and that the devices are safe and performant. That's always the general goal. So to go to the very basis, the very first question is, are we talking about a medical device or not? And you might wonder what this has to do with the whole webinar and the content, but the legislations are different, and as well the definition of what is considered to be a medical device is not 100% the same in both regions. I'm not going to display the definitions here. You can easily find them in both legislations, in the documents. But there are some differences. That being said, for the majority of the devices of the products, what is considered to be a medical device in US, for example, will also be one in Europe and vice versa. But there is a gray area and there are some differences. So you could have devices that are medical devices in one region and not in the other. A very clear example are veterinary products. Veterinary products are part of the definition of medical devices in the US, while they are excluded in Europe. The European definition solely focuses on products for human use. There was actually a directive in Europe up to 2008, if I'm not mistaken, that has been repealed and it was never replaced. So at this point, devices, medical devices that are only intended to be used for animal use are in Europe consumer goods and not under the scope of the MDR or the IVDR. So that's a very clear difference. There might be other products for which the difference is more subtle, but it's important to do this exercise every time for every product because it might actually be that your product is under the medical device regulation, for example, in Europe, but has to comply with different requirements in the US or any other region that you might target. Because here we are mainly focusing on US and EU, but for every other region of the world that you are targeted, where you want to bring your product to the market, you have to do that same exercise. It's very important to know which legislation applies, obviously. For the rest of the webinar, I'm going to assume that we're talking about medical devices only. So now we have to look at the regulatory pathways themselves. And also here, there are similarities. The regulatory pathways in the US, in the EU, and in many other regulated areas are based on risks. When we look at the US, it's the FDA that has the oversight, that is responsible for evaluating whether products can enter, medical devices can enter the market or not. And they have a classification based on the risks associated with the use of the device. It goes from class 1 to 3, so 1 to 3, 1 being the lowest risk device, 3 being the highest risk device. There, when you have a class 1 device, it can be, and there are quite a lot of cases where you have exemptions. So that means that you don't need to get a clearance or an approval before you can bring that product to the market. But it might also be that you need a 510K clearance, which means that your product has a predicate device, so a similar product is already on the market, and you can make use of that approval to get your device cleared, or you can apply for a de novo classification request. When you move to the class 2, so slightly higher risk, most likely you will have to get a 510K clearance or a de novo, but also there are still exemptions possible. And for the class 3, there is a pre-market approval. So that's the most extensive, most time-consuming pathway as well. When we look at Europe, CE marking is central, and the CE certificates are actually granted by a notified body. So here is the next difference. In the US, it's the FDA, which is a government body that has the oversight. In Europe, CE certificates are granted by notified bodies. Notified bodies are independent organizations. There is also not one notified body. You have several notified bodies, and they are all accredited to issue certificates under certain regulations. So you have to have a certificate or, sorry, an accreditation for MDR, for IVDR. So some notified bodies can only issue certificates for medical devices, others can as well for IVDs. Also here, you have a risk-based classification. So it goes from 1 to 3 with some sub classes for the medical devices from A to D when it comes to IVDs, but the principle is the same as in the US. Class 1 devices or Class A IVDs are the lowest risk device, have the least requirements to bring them to the market. Class D, or when it comes to IVDs, or Class 3 when it comes to medical devices, are the highest risk. And so they have much more requirements before you can, I mean, they have to comply with many more requirements before you can bring them to the market. When you want to bring a device to the European market, when it's a Class 1, which does not have a measuring function, is not a reusable surgical instrument, or is not sterile, you can bring this device to the market without obtaining a CE certificate first from a notified body. You will still have to submit your file to the competent authorities, which are the national authorities. So again, Europe consists of 27 countries. So for each country, you have to consider whether or not you have to submit that file, but you can already bring it to the market and you will get questions later on if there are any. As soon as there is a notified body involved, you need to obtain that CE certificate before you can bring the product to the market. So two different regulatory pathways, both based on a risk-based approach. That classification is on a risk-based approach. And actually, you can extend this to most regulated areas. They will all take that risk-based approach. And so the low-risk devices will have less requirements, normally a faster time to market than the high-risk devices. Now, those risks are based on the mode of operation of the device, but as well on the intended use. So the claims that you as a manufacturer make regarding your device and what it is able to do. So there, when we think about a regulatory strategy, you can also think about what kind of claims do I want to make? And for some devices, it's super obvious and there is only one possibility. But for some, it can really depend what kind of claims you make, whether it's, for example, in Europe, a Class 1 or a 2A. And that might change over time. As I said, it's the manufacturer's responsibility, it's the manufacturer's decision what claims are being made, but it can affect the regulatory pathway, and it's something to consider when you want to make certain claims. A device that is Class 1 in the US is not necessarily Class 1 in Europe. So also here, it's important to make that to do that exercise for every region. An example would be a surgical lamp. Surgical lamp is Class 1 device under Rule 13 in the EU, but it's a Class 2 device in the US. However, as I mentioned, there are exemptions as well in Class 2 devices, and in this case, it's the case. So there is an exemption and you can bring it to the market as such. But so there are differences possible in classification. So it's really important to look at those different areas and determine the classification per region. So when we want to build a regulatory strategy, we have to think about a few things to do this in a most efficient way. And the first thing is to start early. And I know it's very easy to say, start early. We have to think about everything from the start. And some companies, especially for startups, they feel a bit overwhelmed. But in this case, it's important to consider this because, as I said, for example, the classification will determine which requirements will follow, which regulatory requirements are applicable to your device. So if you don't think about those regulatory requirements from the start, you might face delays afterwards because you might have missed very important things, which you will have to rectify before you can even put that device to the market, before you can complete your medical device file. So technical file in Europe, design history file in the US. So it's important to know the regions you want to target. If there is a specific order, which regions will affect maybe other approvals, but also think about those claims, think about that intended use to ensure that you do the exercise correctly from the start, that you have the right classification, because those regulatory requirements will also affect the design of your device. When we think about regulatory requirements, it can come from the legislation, but it can also come from standards. If you know already that you will target more than one area, more than one region, it's important to take a comprehensive approach as well. Consider those markets, consider those differences or similarities in classification. It might be that you have a class 2 in the US and a class 2A in Europe, which will be more similar, of course, than when you have a class 1 in one region and a class 2 or higher in another region. You also have to think about your risk management, and I'll come back just in a few minutes. But the risk management is one of the basic requirements in all regions. So there, make sure that it covers everything. When we think about the quality management system, also here, it's a requirement, whether you go for the US market, for the EU market, for any other regulated market, it is a requirement to have a quality management system. So it's also good to think about, let's say, a general set of procedures that cover requirements from the different regions. My personal advice is to not split up per region. It doesn't make sense to have a parallel QMS for the US and for the EU because there is a lot of overlap. I mean, ISO 13485 is used in both of those regions. But even if you go for a region that has their own requirements related to a quality management system, it's still worth to try to have a general set of procedures because it's easier to manage, it avoids duplication, it's less prone to error, and then you can still, if needed, have specific work instructions per region, have specific templates if that's needed. Also think about post-market surveillance activities, trend reporting, stuff like that. I mean, the information you can collect and use for the regions all together, that's time saved. And you should know the similarities and the differences in that respect. I've been talking about the legislation. I briefly mentioned standards. So standards can be different in different regions, but they can also be the same. And if you can make use of the same standard, again, it avoids duplication, double work, and double effort in managing certain parts of the documentation. What is also important in your regulatory strategy is to consider not only the medical device legislation, so the MDR or the US legislation, but also other applicable regulations, such as, for example, the GDPR to protect personal data in Europe, but you also have HIPAA in US. This, if that's applicable to you, to your organization, to your device, it's something that needs to be incorporated as well in your quality management system. It might need to be incorporated in some of the design aspects of your product, depending on what it is exactly. So don't only look at those medical device legislations themselves, but also to the other set of legislation or applicable regulations. When we think about risk management, I already mentioned it's a central piece of the medical device file in all regulated regions when it comes to medical devices. ISO 14971 is actually a very integrated standard, so most regions use that as a standard. So that's easy because you can use that as a basis for all the regions. But it's not only the product risks that you need to think about. You can also, if you have, for example, AI components, now in Europe we have the AI Act, well, that is another kind of risk that you need to take into account, that you need to document, and that will also reflect in, for example, your risk management procedure, but also the way that you document your risks. Not only that, but also business risks need to be taken into account. We are building a strategy. It's a regulatory strategy, but it's part of your business strategy. So also the fact of what happens I have a delay in my CE certificate, in my CE certification. Does that affect any other regulatory approval? What are my priorities? What is my freedom to shift there? So also these kind of risks are important to take into account when building a proper regulatory strategy. And for that, you also need to know and understand the different requirements in the different regions. Understanding those different requirements is not always easy. It can be super complex to navigate the regulatory landscape when you're targeting only one market, but as well when you're targeting multiple markets. If you get a chance to engage with regulatory authorities to seek guidance, it's not a bad thing to consider. I mean, the FDA has really clear procedures on how to seek advice from FDA. So make use of them. If you are unsure or if you need additional feedback, you should seek their advice. In Europe, it's a little bit more difficult because notified bodies cannot act as consultants. That doesn't mean you can't ask any questions either. You can still approach them, especially at the start of your project, to align on certain strategies. To get feedback from them. They will not just, you can't go to them with very general questions, but you can get feedback from them for certain things. So it's good to engage with them, to keep contact throughout the preparation phase, let's say, before you actually submit your file to them. And then one of the very important things as well is to remain flexible. The development of medical devices can take many years, and during that time, the regulations can change, standards can change, market requirements can change, and your own business can change. So keeping that flexibility, making sure that you can easily adapt to whatever decisions that are being made, whatever changes that come on your path, is important. And for that, what you need to consider is not only keeping that flexibility in your planning, in your regulatory strategy itself, but also ensuring that you have a system or a tool in place that allows you to make those changes, to know how all the information is linked so that you can make changes and that you can assess the impact of certain changes on the whole set of documentation. So those are some key points which I believe are critical to build and maintain a regulatory strategy in a very efficient way. So now if we want to look a bit further on how to do these things in an efficient way, to how to avoid double work, let's focus on a few things. So I've been talking about standards already. And standards are not always the same in different regions. But if you can make use of the harmonized standards in Europe, the consensus standards in the US, they are quite similar. And the good thing about them is that they give you presumption of conformity. That means that they are accepted to be a good way of working. So if you, for example, comply with ISO 14971, which is a harmonized standard, which is a consensus standard for risk management, then you know that if you follow that standard, it's an accepted way of doing risk management. So you can do this for several standards. And if you can make use of those standards, at least you have, first of all, certainty that they are accepted. But secondly, if they are accepted in the different regions, it will avoid double work. You don't have to have two systems in parallel, one for each region. So it will reduce the documentation efforts if you can make use of standards that are accepted in all the regions that you want to target. Risk management, again, but it's super important. That's why I keep focusing on it. It's a shared requirement. So making use of ISO 14971 requirements, building that risk management file accordingly will help you, because it will, and you can use it for the submissions in the US and in the EU. So that one, first of all, one of the central pieces of the documentation, and secondly, you can reuse it for almost any region. Another thing are templates. If you can use or build templates that can be used for several regions, it will again reduce the documentation efforts, because you will have to create them once and approve them once, and you can use them for the different regions that you're targeting. Is it always possible? No, but in some cases you can. So if that's the case, and if you incorporate this in your quality management system so that you have a central place to create those templates, to find back those templates, and then use them to create records for the different regions that you're targeting, it will again save you time, save you effort, and reduce the risk of mistakes. So that is a third point or tactic that you can use to avoid double work. And then the fourth one are compliance tools. Technology has evolved over time, and over time we also created tools to help us with these regulatory requirements, with documentation efforts. So making use of those tools can really help you, first of all, enhance the collaboration between teams, but also let them focus on the content and facilitate the creation of documentation. And I will go a bit further on the tools. So you have several tools that can help you. One of them, of course, is matrix requirements. I've been introduced as well. You can see it on my slides. But what is important for tools, I mean, what are features that are important for tools to really help you navigate the similarities and differences in these whole regulatory pathways are, for example, the possibility to make regulation gap analyses. I've been talking about similarities and differences in regulations, in standards, and so on. If you have a tool like Matrix that allows you to make those gap analysis and to link the requirements from regulations, national legislations, standards, to what you really have in your quality management system, but as well in your product documentation, in your product design, then you can really see, okay, these requirements are covered, these requirements are actually similar, here we have differences, here we have gaps, and that really helps you to see within your whole project what still needs to be done, where we have covered everything, where we are compliant, and where we still need to do work to ensure that we are compliant with the different regulatory requirements. So that is one feature that is important to keep the oversight and to really decide like, okay, now we've come to a point where we are ready to submit our files in US, in the EU, in any region that we're targeting. Another thing that is important, and then when I'm really talking about the product design, is that you are able to distinguish between requirements that are similar for the both regions or more regions, if we're not only talking about the US and EU, and which ones are specific for the US or specific for EU. So having a way to really make that difference between, let's say, common requirements or specifications and region-specific requirements and specifications is really helpful. Again, that link to requirements, really paragraphs in a standard or in a legislation, that will really help you determine whether or not you are ready for submission or not. And if you are able to really label those requirements, or even if not only requirements, also procedures, some procedures might be common, and that's what I really would encourage you to think about, but there might be some really specific region-specific procedures as well. So being able to label all those different items within your either QMS or your product design can be really helpful. And if you then have a way in your tool to extract that information into your documentation, this will really help you build region-specific documentation, because in the end, you will have to submit a file to the notified body in Europe, to the FDA in the US, but not having to reproduce or duplicate all that information again and again is a time saver, but will also help you reduce the risk of making mistakes. If you have to do everything in parallel, it's already a nightmare. But then you have to think about the whole life cycle of your device. If you start to make changes, knowing which part of the documentation for which region is affected, that becomes almost impossible without the help of a proper. So being able to do that, being able to extract information from a database and really create those region-specific documents, that is a real game changer. The last point I put here on the slides are templates. So what I mentioned before, if you can have templates that serve both regions or more regions, that's very interesting. If you need to create region-specific templates, if that's possible in your tool and you can still make use of that central database with all the information and you can easily extract it, that is super helpful in the sense that you don't need to duplicate the information and you can still extract the information, put it in the templates and create records out of it. So that being said, what I want to emphasize at the end of the talk here is that what is important is to understand the regulatory requirements, understand them in terms of similarities, understand them in terms of differences, but also understand the bigger picture, knowing what is the medical device requirement in a certain region, but also knowing what other requirements come with it. If you can leverage a tool that helps you really showcase it and display it in an easy way, that that can make things much more easy to monitor and more efficient. You also need to plan. Regulatory pathways are complex. They need careful planning. As I said, you also have to take into consideration your business decisions, timelines. So maybe approval in one region will affect approval in other regions in the future. So that is part of understanding, but also part of planning and knowing what are the priorities. Avoid double work. Try to be as efficient as possible. Use the similarities in the regulations, in the regulatory requirements to your advantage. Use tools that allow you to do so. And then remain flexible. Everything can change. Regulatory landscape is a dynamic thing, but also your business, also the development of your device itself can change. So you have to remain flexible there and then use the right tool. So again, tools are there to help you to do things in a more efficient way. Matrix is one of those tools. So if you look at the features of a tool, think about how it can help you to define the similarities and the differences between those regulatory pathways and the regulatory requirements, but also link it to your own product design, your own quality management system, and see how it can help you be flexible, how it can help you cover changes, monitor changes, see what is the impact of certain changes on your documentation. And when you have a tool like that, it will help you to be more efficient throughout your regulatory planning, the strategies, and the entering to the different markets. So with that, I want to conclude my talk. I want to thank everybody, and I'm happy to answer questions.
All righty, thank you, Anne. Give me a moment to get prepared here. I have a couple questions to ask from the audience. The first is ISO 14971 relevant for the US market? Same question for ISO 62304.
Yes, they're both relevant to both in the EU and the US. So 62304 is about software in a medical device. So we have 62304 and we have 82304 for standalone software. Both are relevant in the US. And then was 14971, I believe you said? Well, that's risk. Was it 14971? That's risk management, and that's definitely relevant in both markets. Yes.
Okay, great. Yes, and it was 14971. The next question is, do IVD and IVDR have the same classification? Also for MD and MDR?
So what do you mean by MD and IVD? Medical device and in vitro diagnostic. So in the EU, you have a regulation for both. So you have the medical device regulation and the in vitro diagnostic regulation. In the maybe you meant the MDD, the medical device directive versus the regulation.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure since
I'm not sure.
Anonymous question. So it might be something you want to get back to.
I'll assume it's that. But I'll assume it's that. So we went from actually three directives in Europe: the Active Implantable Medical Device Directive, the Medical Device Directive, and the In Vitro Diagnostics Directive. The MDR covers the active implantables and the general medical devices. So that's one regulation now that covers both. When we made the change from the directives to the regulation, the classification rules were also updated. So there are differences between the directives and the regulation as it exists since 2017. So it's important to redo the exercise in terms of classifications, because some products actually went to a higher class, changed class. So that's an important one. When we talk about IVDs, it's a complete overhaul. So the whole classification scheme changed. We had a list A and a list B in the directive. Now we have class A, B, C, D in the regulation, where we used to have like 90% of the in vitro diagnostics that did not need notified body involvement, and only 10% actually needed a CE certificate. Now it's the other way around. So all of a sudden, 90% of the in vitro diagnostics need a CE certificate issued by a notified body. So you can imagine that for this industry, it's a huge change. It's still ongoing. The deadlines have been postponed already a few times. But so yes, there is a big change between the directives and the regulations.
Great, thank you for that. The next question is from John. Do the EU NBs have a process similar to the FDA pre-submission process?
Yes and no. You can, I mean, what you can do with the notified, but what is actually done is you have different phases in your audits. You have a phase 1 or a stage 1 audit, a stage 2 audit. So in the stage 1 audit, you will have, let's say, a more informal, general audit where they will already sample a lot of different things and give you feedback. But if you have non-conformities there, it's not like the official non-conformities. You have time to change, to adapt, to make improvements. When you go to the stage 2, then they will do again an audit. But then when you have non-conformities, they will appear in the report, and depending on whether it's minor or major, you might or might not be granted already a certificate or not. So that's what exists with the notified bodies. So yeah, you do have some stages before you can get to the final certification where you get some feedback, but it's not that you can really upfront ask for a full review and get their advice whether or not. That is actually what happens in that stage 1, which is less formal than the stage 2, but it's still a real audit.
Great. You have a few questions coming in, so we do have time to cover them all, I believe. So Keith is asking, is there a checklist of US and EU requirements that can be used for, let's say, a startup?
Unfortunately, not. It would be great if we have like this one checklist to go to. If there would be, I would show it here. What you do have is you have IMDRF guidance documents where you can really see which requirements there are, but it doesn't mean that you have like the full layout of all the documents you might need. It's also difficult in the sense that you have, I mean, medical devices are a super broad field. You have everything from a bandage to a super sophisticated surgical robot. So the requirements are not, I mean, it's not the same for all the different kinds of medical devices. So what you do have, for example, in the MDR is the Annex 1, the GSPR, the General Safety and Performance Requirements. This is, if you want, a checklist, but it's very high level, and you have to determine whether or not they are applicable to you, which standards you will use to show compliance, and then show the proof. I mean, that you can also, the same kind of exercise you can do for for the US, if you are building your medical device file for the US. But it's not that there is like this one web page where you can really see the nice overview of everything that you need to supply for your specific device. Everything that exists is very high level, and the difficulty, the real exercise here is, first of all, determining the classification, but then secondly, also knowing which standards are applicable, because from those standards, you will get additional requirements in terms of testing, in terms of what kind of proof you need to supply for that specific device. So unfortunately, no, there is not one big standard, a big checklist that you can just use. The IMDRF guidances, the medical device guidances on the European webpage could help you. Also for notified bodies, what you can find, but then you really have to know already what notified body you will work with. Some of them do provide an outline of their expectations on their website. So, and it will be similar to those high-level guidance documents, but at least then you know, okay, I'm working with this specific notified body, and here is how they would like to see the documents provided to them. So those 3 resources I would recommend if you want to, depending on, of course, which area or which region you're targeting, but I would recommend looking into those.
Okay. And I sorted the questions by upvotes. So the most popular questions I'm going to ask first. What are some examples of compliance tools?
Well, one of them is matrix requirements. So compliance tools, yes. And I mean, there are so many. What is important, I think, is that you really need to look at which one fits for your organization. If you have a very lean organization, you don't want to have a tool that blocks you in everything you want to do. If you have a super complex organization, you might actually need a tool that gives you a little bit more structure. So it really depends on the complexity of your organization, on the complexity of your product. What I think is important, I mean, the things I mentioned during the presentation, but to really look at how can this tool help my organization? Not do I need to bend or modify my organization in order to be able to use the tool. If that's the case, chances are it won't work and you will change your mind after a while.
The next question is, what's your view of the FDA adopting ISO 13485 in the future? And this is a very popular question.
Well, I think it's a good thing, of course, because at least I mean, EU and US will be aligned more. Of course, it doesn't mean that there will not be any additional requirements coming from the US legislation or from the European legislation. But I think it's a real step forward in aligning regulatory requirements between the 2 regions to use that same fundamental standard. I mean, ISO 13485 is about quality management system. Quality management system affects the whole organization, affects how you control and monitor everything related to your medical device. So it's really the basis of how you deal with a lot of the different aspects related to your medical device. So both regions truly adopting that standard, I think it's a step forward to make the life of manufacturers easier in terms of compliance. One thing to keep in mind is that there will still be US specific requirements, the same as you have specific requirements coming from the MDR, that will need to be incorporated in your quality management system as well.
Great, thank you for the very thorough responses. Those are great. Keith wants to know, does matrix requirements help a company with the QMS being uploaded to a computer system?
Yes, we do. I mean, if you already have a set of procedures, of work instructions, we can help you to upload them or transfer them into matrix, into your own matrix instance. Yes. What we also do is, I mean, we have two modules, one for product documentation. So let's say everything related to requirements, requirement management, traceability, and so on. We also have on top of that then the QMS module. So when we're talking about the QMS module, we help you insert, or it's actually a very easy system, so you can upload that information or copy that information into our system. For those who have to start from scratch, we also give, let's say, a starting point. We have projects that help you really start to set up a quality management system for yourself.
Great, thank you for that. The next question is, when planning clinical trials in the US and EU, are there any key guidances and differences?
Well, again, it really, so how a clinical study or clinical evaluation should look like depends, of course, on your device itself, on the complexity, on who will be using it, and so on. So what is important is you have this ISO 14155, if I'm not mistaken, and that is a standard that is used globally, globally meaning US, EU. So that can serve as a basis on how to set up the studies, the evaluations, and then there are guidance documents in both regions that can help you with the specific regional differences or regional requirements when it comes to those studies. In general, I would say, I mean, if you are planning to target both regions, it might be, and that really depends on your product, whether you can have one study to cover both submissions, or you have to do a separate study in both regions. And again, that really depends on the device. It depends on who needs to use it. So you have language differences. If there would be a difference in patient population and so on that you need to take into account. So it's very difficult to give one answer to that. It really depends on the device, but again, as I said, there is this ISO 14155 that can serve as a basis, but then I would really advise to look at the MDCG guidance documents from Europe, to the US FDA guidance documents for clinical studies when it comes to medical devices, to really see what is applicable to me, depending on the nature of the device we're talking about.
All right, thank you. Let's see, the next question, we do have a couple more questions coming in, and I just wanted to let you know that we do have to make a hard end at 11 a.m. Eastern time. So I'm going to ask one more question, and the rest of the questions we'll go ahead and send to Anne and Matrix requirements for them to follow up with some answers for attendees. So the last question is, can tools like Matrix replace specialized consultants?
We don't intend to replace specialized consultants. It's actually the aim of a tool like Matrix is to, first of all, facilitate the requirements management, the creation of a quality management system. I've explained it enough during the webinar to help you with really linking all the information together, knowing what are the requirements, and then linking it to what do I have in my documentation, where are the gaps, what do I still need to do, or where am I good to go. It does not provide you with the experience and the knowledge that a consultant might have. So it actually is something that can work together with the information from a consultant. A tool like Matrix gives you the ownership of your documentation. You have the documentation in hand, you can make the changes, you can work with the documentation, you can build that traceability and do that gap analysis. It gives you everything in one place, both for the QMS as well as for your product documentation. A consultant can provide you with their own expertise. They can guide you in finding documentation. They can guide you in making the decision about classification, for example. They can tell you what is important in terms of applicable standards. And with that information, you can really build your database of information in Matrix, and you can manage and monitor it and make the changes and extract the documentation from there. So no, it will not replace consultants, but it will give you ownership and it will give you the possibility to create and really keep the overview of your project, your device information, your quality management system.
All righty. And with that, Anne, any last or closing remarks? Because I do think we have to go. I think you're on a tight schedule.
That's true. Well, I would like to thank everybody also for the very interesting questions. As mentioned before, if you have more questions, do send them and I will answer them later on in an email. And if you're curious about Matrix requirements, do scan the QR code, go to our website, ask for a demo, and we'll be happy to show you our system.